The arrest, trial, and conviction of Joseph James DeAngelo brought a long-awaited end to one of the most harrowing criminal cases in American history. But even as the courtroom doors closed behind him, the questions remained. Who was this man behind the mask? How did a seemingly ordinary neighbor, father, and police officer become one of the most feared serial offenders the country had ever known? The truth was both unsettling and chillingly mundane. DeAngelo lived a life that, from the outside, appeared completely ordinary. He worked as a police officer, raised a family, and maintained a quiet presence in his suburban neighborhood. Yet, behind that mask of normalcy, he harbored violent urges and a thirst for control that manifested in the most horrific ways imaginable. His ability to live undetected for decades spoke to a duality that was as terrifying as his crimes themselves. Psychologists and criminologists have since speculated about DeAngelo's motives. Some believe that his early dismissal from the police force triggered a need to exert power and dominance over others, a way to reclaim control in a life where he had faced personal humiliation. Others point to his meticulous planning and knowledge of law enforcement procedures as evidence of a man who thrived on being one step ahead of those who pursued him. For the victims and their families, DeAngelo's arrest was both a relief and a painful reminder of all that had been lost. His actions left permanent scars, lives cut short, families torn apart, and a generation forced to live under the shadow of fear. Yet, in their pursuit of justice, those affected by his crimes also became symbols of resilience and courage. The legacy of the Golden State Killer extends beyond the crimes themselves. His capture demonstrated the extraordinary power of perseverance, technological advancement, and the determination of both investigators and civilians. The use of DNA genealogy to track him down opened new pathways for solving cold cases worldwide, offering hope to victims who had long believed justice would never come. As DeAngelo sits behind bars, serving multiple life sentences, the terror he once inspired begins to fade, replaced by a sense of closure and healing. His name, once synonymous with fear, is now a cautionary reminder of how the worst horrors can sometimes hide in plain sight. The true face behind the mask was not a monster from legend but an ordinary man who chose to commit unspeakable acts. In the end, the story of the Golden State Killer is not just one of violence and fear, it is a testament to the strength of those who refused to be silenced, the persistence of law enforcement, and the enduring belief that even the darkest mysteries can eventually be brought to light. The crimes of Joseph James DeAngelo left a mark far deeper than the physical evidence found at his crime scenes. His reign of terror forever changed California and reshaped the way society viewed personal safety, criminal investigations, and the role of technology in solving crimes. The psychological scars from his attacks lingered not just with his victims but also across entire communities that had once considered themselves safe. In the neighborhoods he targeted, fear became a part of daily life. People who had once left their doors unlocked began to fortify their homes with security systems and heavy locks. The idea of a peaceful suburban existence where families could sleep without fear was shattered. His crimes led to a shift in how communities viewed personal security, resulting in an explosion of neighborhood watch programs and increased collaboration with local law enforcement. Law enforcement agencies across the country also changed the way they approached serial crimes in the wake of DeAngelo's attacks. Multi-jurisdictional task forces became more common, ensuring that information sharing between different police departments would no longer be a barrier to catching serial offenders. Investigators learned the importance of collaboration, a lesson that became pivotal in solving future cases. One of the most significant impacts of the Golden State Killer case was the rise of DNA genealogy as a revolutionary tool in criminal investigations. DeAngelo's capture through a public DNA database set a precedent for future cold cases. In the years following his arrest, law enforcement solved dozens of previously unsolved crimes using the same technique. However, this advancement also sparked debates about privacy and ethics. Critics questioned the use of personal genetic information in criminal investigations, while others hailed it as a vital breakthrough for justice. The cultural impact of DeAngelo's crimes extended beyond law enforcement. The case inspired a surge of interest in true crime media, from documentaries and podcasts to books and feature films. Michelle McNamara's groundbreaking book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, brought renewed public interest to the case shortly before DeAngelo's arrest. and her work was credited with reigniting efforts to solve the mystery. For survivors and their families, the legacy of the Golden State Killer was deeply personal. Many found solace in knowing that their attacker had finally been brought to justice. Support groups and counseling services were established to help victims process their trauma, and some survivors became advocates for victims' rights, using their experiences to push for changes in legislation and law enforcement practices. The shadow of DeAngelo's crimes will never fully disappear, but his capture and conviction brought a sense of closure to a story that had haunted California for over 4 decades. His legacy, while built on fear and violence, also became a symbol of resilience, justice, and the power of perseverance in the face of overwhelming darkness. The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo was just the beginning of a long journey toward justice. After more than 4 decades of fear and uncertainty, the survivors and the families of the victims finally had the chance to face the man responsible for their suffering. But the legal process would prove to be as complex as the case itself. DeAngelo's trial became one of the most highly anticipated court cases in American history. Prosecutors were determined to seek the maximum punishment, but they also faced the challenge of balancing the needs of justice with the wishes of the victims, many of whom were elderly or had waited years for closure. The COVID-19 pandemic further complicated the proceedings, delaying court dates and forcing much of the legal process to be conducted virtually. In June 2020, DeAngelo shocked the nation when he agreed to plead guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping. This plea deal spared him the death penalty but ensured that he would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. The plea also included admissions of guilt for dozens of rapes and burglaries, which, due to the statute of limitations, could no longer be prosecuted. The trial's most emotional moments came during the victim impact statements. One by one, survivors and family members of the victims took the stand to confront the man who had terrorized their lives. Many spoke of the lasting trauma, the sleepless nights, and the fear that never truly left them. Some, like survivor Jane Carson Sandler, spoke directly to DeAngelo, reclaiming their power after years of silence. DeAngelo himself remained largely emotionless throughout the proceedings. The frail, elderly man in the courtroom seemed a stark contrast to the terrifying figure who had once terrorized California. But as victim after victim spoke, witnesses reported seeing subtle signs of acknowledgement, an occasional nod, averted eyes, or clenched hands. In August 2020, DeAngelo was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence brought a sense of closure to many of the victims and their families, though the psychological wounds left by his crimes would never fully heal. The trial also served as a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. The survivors, many of whom had lived in fear for decades, found strength in speaking their truth and reclaiming their narratives. Their courage became an inspiration, proving that even in the face of unimaginable horror, justice was possible. For the investigators who had spent their careers pursuing the Golden State Killer, the trial marked the end of a relentless pursuit. Justice had been served, and the shadow that had loomed over California for so many years had finally been lifted. On April 24, 2018, after decades of fear, frustration, and unanswered questions, the nightmare that had haunted California for over 40 years finally came to an end. Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old former police officer, was arrested at his home in Citrus Heights, California. The man who had eluded capture for so long was no longer a faceless phantom. He was a quiet neighbor, a father, and a man living an ordinary life with an extraordinary secret. The arrest sent shockwaves through the nation. DeAngelo had lived in the same neighborhood for years, mowing his lawn, shopping for groceries, and exchanging polite greetings with his neighbors. No one could have imagined that behind his seemingly mundane existence lurked the mind of one of the most terrifying serial offenders in American history. The arrest unfolded with little drama. Detectives, having confirmed his DNA through discarded samples, approached DeAngelo's home under the guise of a casual investigation. When they moved in to apprehend him, he offered no resistance. In fact, according to officers present, DeAngelo muttered under his breath, "I have a roast in the oven." It was a bizarrely mundane remark from a man accused of such heinous crimes. News of the arrest spread like wildfire. Survivors of the Golden State Killer's attacks, many of whom had spent decades living in fear and uncertainty, expressed a mixture of relief and lingering trauma. Some had built their entire lives around the fear that he might one day return. Now, finally, they could begin to confront their past without the looming threat of the unknown. Investigators soon uncovered unsettling details about DeAngelo's life. As a police officer in the 1970s, he had worked in Auburn, California, before being dismissed for shoplifting, a seemingly minor offense at the time, but one that, in hindsight, revealed cracks in his carefully maintained facade. His knowledge of police procedures and investigative techniques likely helped him evade capture for so long. Inside his home, police found a trove of items believed to be souvenirs from his crimes. Jewelry, personal mementos, and other small objects were discovered, tokens that served as chilling reminders of his victims and the psychological hold he maintained over them even decades later. The arrest was not just a victory for law enforcement but a testament to the resilience of the victims, their families, and the tireless investigators who never gave up hope. The moment Joseph James DeAngelo was taken into custody marked the end of one of the longest and most terrifying manhunts in American history. Yet, for many, the arrest was only the beginning of a new chapter. Questions still lingered. Why had he stopped? How had he lived undetected for so long? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, was there more to his story than anyone had yet discovered? For decades, the Golden State Killer remained a specter haunting California's darkest memories. Every lead had gone cold, and traditional investigative methods had failed to unmask him. It seemed as though he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a trail of unspeakable crimes and unanswered questions. But in the early 2000s, a new tool emerged, one that would eventually crack the case wide open: DNA forensics. At first, DNA technology was primitive and slow. Early attempts to analyze the genetic material collected from crime scenes were hampered by limited databases and technological constraints. But as science advanced, so did law enforcement's ability to use DNA as a powerful investigative tool. By 2001, forensic experts confirmed that the East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same man, finally linking two of California's most infamous unsolved cases into a single horrifying narrative. Despite this breakthrough, the true identity of the Golden State Killer remained hidden. The DNA evidence could prove connections between crimes, but without a match in any criminal database, investigators were left with nothing but the genetic profile of a ghost. The frustration among law enforcement was palpable. They knew the killer's genetic fingerprint, but without a name to connect it to, justice remained out of reach. The turning point came in 2018 with the rise of commercial genealogy websites like GEDmatch, where people uploaded their DNA results to find distant relatives and trace their ancestry. Investigators, driven by desperation and innovation, decided to upload the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to the site. The results were staggering. While they didn't find a direct match, they discovered distant relatives of the suspect. Using painstaking genealogical research, investigators built extensive family trees, tracing potential suspects through public records, birth certificates, and marriage licenses. After months of research, all the evidence pointed toward one man: Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer living quietly in Citrus Heights, California. DeAngelo had never been on law enforcement's radar, primarily because he had no criminal record that would have placed his DNA in any official database. Yet, his history raised red flags. He had been dismissed from the police force in 1979 for shoplifting, a seemingly minor offense but one that, in retrospect, hinted at a much darker compulsion. To confirm their suspicions, detectives conducted surveillance on DeAngelo, collecting discarded items like tissue samples to compare against the DNA profile from the crime scenes. The results were conclusive. After more than 4 decades, the Golden State Killer's reign of terror had come to an end. The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo was not just a victory for law enforcement but a testament to the relentless determination of those who refused to let the case go cold. It was also a triumph of science over fear, proving that no matter how much time passes, technology and justice will eventually catch up to even the most elusive of criminals. By 1986, the killing spree that had haunted California for over a decade came to an abrupt and chilling halt. The man who had terrorized families, invaded homes, and committed unspeakable acts of violence seemed to vanish without a trace. Law enforcement agencies were left with nothing but cold leads and unanswered questions. These were the silent years, a time when the Golden State Killer appeared to have disappeared entirely. Speculation ran rampant among investigators and criminologists. Some believed the killer had been arrested for an unrelated crime, locked away without anyone realizing the connection. Others thought he might have died or been forced to stop due to injury or illness. A more chilling theory suggested he had simply chosen to stop, satisfied with the devastation he had wrought. Despite the absence of new crimes, the fear he instilled remained deeply rooted in the communities he had once terrorized. Survivors continued to live under the shadow of trauma, and the public's imagination kept the horror alive through media coverage and true crime books. Every creak in the night, every unexplained noise reminded victims and their families of the terror they had once faced. Law enforcement, however, never truly gave up. Cold case units revisited old evidence, hoping that advancements in forensic science could provide new leads. In the 1990s, DNA profiling became a critical tool for solving crimes. Investigators from across California began to re-examine evidence collected from the crime scenes of the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker. In 2001, a breakthrough came. DNA evidence confirmed what some detectives had long suspected: the two serial offenders were, in fact, the same person. This revelation reignited interest in the case, but identifying the suspect remained elusive. The killer had left behind no fingerprints, no definitive physical evidence that could tie him to his crimes beyond the DNA itself. For nearly 2 more decades, the Golden State Killer remained a nameless ghost, a phantom of California's darkest nightmares. As the years dragged on, the victims' families demanded justice. Press conferences were held, books were published, and documentaries aired, all in an effort to keep the case alive. Each effort carried the same hope: that someone, somewhere, would recognize the man behind the mask. What no one anticipated was that the breakthrough would come from an entirely unexpected source. With the rise of consumer DNA testing and genealogy websites, investigators found a new avenue for their search. In 2018, using a public genealogy database, law enforcement officers traced the killer's family tree through distant relatives' DNA. And then, after decades of silence, the phantom finally had a name: Joseph James DeAngelo. A former police officer living quietly in a Sacramento suburb. The discovery was as shocking as it was chilling. The man who had haunted California's nights for so long had been hiding in plain sight, living an ordinary life while carrying an extraordinary secret. By 1979, the East Area Rapist had vanished from Northern California, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and unanswered questions. But the nightmare was far from over. In Southern California, a new predator emerged, one whose brutality exceeded anything seen before. The police called him the original Night Stalker, though it would be years before they realized they were dealing with the same man. This time, his crimes escalated to murder. His first known victims, Robert Offerman and Deborah Alexandra Manning, were found brutally murdered in their Santa Barbara County home. The killer showed no mercy, binding and executing the couple with terrifying precision. Unlike his earlier crimes, there was no clear pattern of stalking beforehand. The attacks were sudden, violent, and meticulously executed. The original Night Stalker's modus operandi combined the psychological torment of his earlier crimes with an even greater level of violence. He would break into homes under cover of darkness, often entering silently through unlocked windows or sliding glass doors. Victims were typically found bound, gagged, and brutally assaulted before being murdered. In some cases, he left no sign of forced entry, fueling fears that he had been watching his victims for days, learning the vulnerabilities of their homes. The fear spread rapidly across Southern California. Couples were especially terrified, knowing that even the safety of numbers was no guarantee against this calculating killer. Police were left with minimal clues: no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and only a chilling signature. Bindings often tied in the same distinct knot, and personal items stolen from the crime scenes. One of the most haunting aspects of the original Night Stalker's reign of terror was his complete control over every crime scene. He left behind almost no forensic evidence, and his ability to disappear into the night left investigators scrambling for leads. The randomness of his attacks made him impossible to profile. He targeted victims of all ages, backgrounds, and neighborhoods. Despite the best efforts of multiple police agencies, the killer's identity remained elusive. The brutality and precision of his attacks led some investigators to believe that they were dealing with someone with military or police training. Unfortunately, their theories remained just that, untested and unproven, as the case went cold. By 1986, the murders suddenly stopped. No one knew why. Some speculated that the killer had been arrested for an unrelated crime or had died. Others believed he had simply moved on, satisfied with the terror and devastation he had left behind. Little did anyone realize that he had merely returned to the shadows, content to let his legacy of fear fester in the minds of those he left behind. After vanishing from Visalia in 1976, the man who would become known as the Golden State Killer resurfaced with a new name and a far more terrifying modus operandi. No longer content with simple burglaries, he evolved into a predator of unimaginable cruelty, one who became infamous as the East Area Rapist. His crimes began in the suburbs of Sacramento, but the fear he spread would soon grip all of Northern California. The pattern was chilling. He targeted women who lived alone or couples sleeping peacefully in their homes. His method was methodical. He often stalked his victims for days, learning their routines, mapping their neighborhoods, and studying the smallest details of their lives. Then, late at night, he would break in, sometimes even while the victims were already sleeping, armed with a weapon, usually a knife or a gun. His first step was to bind his victims tightly with shoelaces or cords, leaving them helpless. But what truly set the East Area Rapist apart was his sadistic psychological manipulation. For couples, he would force the man to lie face down while balancing plates or cups on his back, warning that if he heard a sound, he would kill them both. This wasn't just physical domination, it was a deliberate effort to instill relentless terror. The fear of making even the smallest mistake was a weapon as sharp as any blade. The assaults were brutal and methodical, leaving deep psychological scars on every survivor. Yet, his most disturbing feature was his ability to evade capture, even as he taunted police and the public. In one notorious instance, he made phone calls to his victims after the attacks, whispering threats like, "I'll be back," into the receiver, ensuring that the horror never truly ended for those who survived. As the number of attacks grew, over 50 confirmed by 1979, the community descended into fear and paranoia. Gun sales skyrocketed, neighborhood watch programs formed overnight, and the once peaceful suburbs of Sacramento became fortresses of locked doors and drawn curtains. Despite extensive investigations, including composite sketches and tireless patrols, the East Area Rapist remained a ghost. His knowledge of police tactics and his meticulous planning led investigators to believe he was someone familiar with law enforcement practices. They couldn't have known how close they were to the truth. In 1979, as suddenly as he had appeared, the East Area Rapist seemed to vanish from Northern California. But the terror he spread didn't end there. He was already planning his next move, one that would take his violence to even darker extremes. Before the name Golden State Killer would strike fear into the hearts of millions, there was the Visalia ransacker, a shadow who crept through the quiet neighborhoods of Visalia, California, in the mid-1970s. His crimes seemed minor at first, almost juvenile in nature. Homes were broken into, but rather than stealing valuable items, the intruder took small, personal objects, coins, family heirlooms, and sentimental keepsakes. It wasn't about the monetary value. It was about the invasion, the violation of space, and the power that came from knowing he had been there without being caught. The ransacker's signature was as unsettling as it was bizarre. Drawers were emptied methodically, their contents scattered across the floor as if to send a message. "I was here, and I touched everything you hold dear." Sometimes, he rearranged items or left strange displays behind, an eerie reminder to his victims that their privacy had been shattered in the most intimate way possible. At first, local law enforcement dismissed the break-ins as the work of a petty thief, perhaps even a troubled teenager acting out, but as the number of incidents grew, eventually surpassing 120 documented burglaries, detectives began to realize that they were dealing with something far more sinister. The ransacker was escalating, and his behavior became increasingly unpredictable. The fear reached new heights with the murder of Claude Snelling in 1975. Snelling, a journalism professor, was shot and killed while attempting to stop a masked intruder from abducting his teenage daughter. This tragic event marked a turning point in the investigation. The Visalia Ransacker was no longer just a voyeuristic burglar, he had become a killer. Despite increased patrols and heightened public awareness, the ransacker managed to elude capture. His knowledge of law enforcement tactics and meticulous planning led some investigators to suspect that he might have had police training or an intimate understanding of investigative procedures. Ironically, that suspicion would prove chillingly accurate decades later. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, the Visalia ransacker vanished in 1976. For years, investigators were left with nothing but fragmented clues, unanswered questions, and a haunting realization: the man responsible for terrorizing Visalia wasn't done yet. He was simply moving on to a new hunting ground, one where his crimes would grow darker, more violent, and infinitely more terrifying. It was a name that haunted California for decades, a shadowy figure whose crimes spanned over 10 years and whose identity remained a mystery for far too long. The Golden State Killer was not just a criminal. He was a phantom who moved silently through the suburbs of California, breaking into homes, committing unspeakable acts, and disappearing without a trace. For years, entire communities lived in fear, locking their doors at night, drawing their curtains tightly shut, and listening for the slightest sound in the darkness. The fear was not unfounded. Between 1974 and 1986, this unknown assailant was responsible for at least 13 murders, over 50 sexual assaults, and more than 100 burglaries across the state of California. What made his crimes so terrifying wasn't just the violence, it was the way he seemed to enjoy playing psychological games with his victims. He didn't just break into homes. He shattered the very sense of safety that people had in their own beds, turning every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind into a reminder that no one was ever truly safe. But for all his cunning and cruelty, the Golden State Killer remained a ghost. Police departments across multiple jurisdictions worked tirelessly, following hundreds of leads and compiling mountains of evidence. Yet, the man behind the mask always seemed to be one step ahead. His ability to evade capture wasn't just luck, it was methodical, calculated, and terrifyingly intelligent. For decades, the case went cold, leaving only scars and unanswered questions. Who was this man? How could someone capable of such horrific violence simply disappear? As time passed, many feared that justice would never be served, that the Golden State Killer would die as he had lived an enigma lurking in the shadows of California's darkest nightmares. Then, in 2018, everything changed. A breakthrough in DNA technology finally unveiled the true identity of the man who had terrorized a state and left countless lives shattered in his wake. His name? Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer, a husband, a father, a neighbor who had lived a seemingly ordinary life while hiding a monstrous secret. The revelation sent shockwaves across the nation and proved that no matter how long it takes, justice has a way of catching up to even the most cunning of criminals. This is the story of fear, survival, and the relentless pursuit of justice. This is the story of the Golden State Killer.